Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.
Hello and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Beth Courtney, President of Louisiana Public Broadcasting. This evening we're talking about a very serious and complicated topic.
And I'm Charlie Whinham, news anchor for Louisiana, the state we're in. When Adam Lanza killed 20 children and 6 adults at Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012, pundits blamed a broken mental health system. 2 months ago, a young man again went on a killing spree, this time near a California college. Unlike Lanza, he had received extensive mental health treatment, and law enforcement authorities even had checked on him.
Well, the incident has renewed the debate over how and whether to require people with serious mental illnesses to receive psychiatric care. How does Louisiana determine if someone is a danger to themselves or others? How difficult is it to intervene if an afflicted individual refuses treatment? And how accessible are services for persons with mental health issues? Tonight, Louisiana Public Square looks for answers to these questions and more on Defining Dangerous.
Tomorrow is the day of retribution, the day in which I will have my revenge against humanity.
22-year-old Elliot Rodger posted these chilling words on YouTube shortly before his May 23rd killing spree that left 6 people dead and 13 injured. Rodger was mentally ill and had been seeing multiple therapists. He had even been visited by the police at the request of his mother. Kevin Robshaw is director of Louisiana's Mental Health Advocacy Services. Robshaw says if Elliot Rodger lived in Louisiana, the outcome might have been very different.
His mother could have gone to the coroner and said, "This is the video that's so disturbing. I'm very concerned about my son. I think he's going to hurt somebody, physically hurt somebody in the near future or immediately." And if the coroner believed that she was credible, he could execute an order for protective custody. The order of protective custody could be given to the sheriff or law enforcement officer. They could have gone to the apartment where her son was, and they could have picked him up.
After an examination by a doctor, an individual can be involuntarily committed for up to 15 days. Robshaw says any coroner in the state has the discretion to issue an order for protective custody.
I'm not diagnosed with a mental illness. I'm more likely to commit a violent crime than an individual diagnosed with mental illness.
Nick Richard is with the St. Tammany Parish Chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI. He says high-profile cases such as Rodger's paint an inaccurate picture of the mentally ill and violence. While research indicates that the vast majority of people who have a mental illness are not violent, the one variable, Richard says, is how faithful they are in their treatment.
So let's say someone's diagnosed with a mental illness, they're off their medication, and they're abusing a substance, and they're male, and they've had previous history of violence. Are they likely to commit a violent act? Yes, much more likely than an individual diagnosed with a mental illness who's on their medication, who has adequate support, who is doing all the things they need to be doing.
According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the percentage of adults in the nation with any mental illness, or AMI, is 19.77%. Louisiana's rate of adults with AMI is 19.81%. Louisiana's rate of serious mental illness is 3.6%, just below the national average of 4%. Prior to the introduction of effective medication in the 1950s, the mentally ill were often confined in state mental hospitals with abysmal conditions. By the 70s, books and movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest created a move for deinstitutionalization.
So we started realizing that people, they would, if they could receive treatment in their homes and in the community, they would get better quicker and they would do better and they would actually recover. The problem is we ended up discharging everyone out of the institutions before we set up the structure in the community to have outpatient services.
The haphazard release of mental patients left many on the streets. It's estimated 20% of the homeless suffer from severe mental illness, compared to just 4% of the nation. And a recent report by the Advocacy Center and the National Sheriff's Association notes that 10 times as many people with mental illnesses are in prison compared to state hospitals.
David was either incarcerated or institutionalized in the last 15 years of his life, probably about 18 times.
Bill O'Quinn's 43-year-old son David suffered from paranoid schizophrenia as well as agnosia, the inability to perceive he had a problem. This resulted in a continuous cycle of going on and off his prescriptions. After an intense confrontation with his father last April, David left his family's house.
And when he left, I called the police, because in the past, the Baton Rouge police, in the past he would be picked up, generally taken straight to a hospital, because in my mind it's pretty obvious that he's having a psychotic episode. And for some reason this time they arrested him for disturbing the peace.
David was put into parish prison for 13 days. He wasn't administered his medication and became violent.
So for 9 of the 13 days he was in a restraining chair, not 24 hours a day, but in that restraining chair. Unfortunately, the ankle restraints created a wound on his leg that created an embolism that went to his heart and lungs, and that's how he died.
While Louisiana law says an inmate in the custody of the state can be forced to be medicated if a doctor agrees, it makes no mention of parish prisons. A lack of access for individuals in Louisiana seeking mental health services earned the state a D rating from NAMI's report card on the delivery of mental health care. Privatization efforts have reduced the number of hospital beds and forced the closure of mental health clinics like the one at Earl K. Long in Baton Rouge. Nick Richard.
It's kind of sad. It's a sad state of affairs to see how our behavioral health system works in the state right now. It's difficult to get consistent access to affordable treatment. And on top of that, our state has decided not to expand Medicaid.
The American Mental Health Counselors Association estimates 163,000 Louisiana residents with mental illness remain uninsured because Louisiana chose not to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. Despite the obstacles for Louisianians who have a mental illness and receive treatment, recovery is real.
My diagnosis is bipolar disorder with psychotic features.
Anxious even as a child, Tracey Moseley didn't have her first psychotic episode until the age of 33. Hospitalized briefly, Moseley says that it's taken nearly 11 years to get on the right combination of medications and therapy to achieve peace.
Recovery is going to look different for everyone. And it's a process. There's no end point. You don't get to a point and you say, I'm recovered. You know, it's a lot like addiction. It's something that you have to be mindful of in your life every day. People with mental illness need to connect and meet other people who are going through the same thing they are. Because for me, that was really the turning point in my life, is when I saw people who were walking the path up ahead of me, and I realized I don't have to just accept where I am now. I can push myself.
Joining me in our studio audience tonight to explore mental health issues in Louisiana are residents from Greater Baton Rouge area as well as St. Tammany Parish. They include family members of individuals in recovery, students at Southern University and LSU, a member of law enforcement, and the State Director of Mental Health America. We also have 2 representatives of the Legislative Youth Advisory Council, so welcome one and all to LPB, and thanks so much for being part of this very important conversation. And I'm delighted just to see the cross-section of folks who are here tonight. So let's start. LSU Public Policy Research Lab, they surveyed over 130 citizens on tonight's topic. Here's a look at some of the responses. When asked if they know someone who suffers from a mental illness, while 65% of respondents said no, more than 1/3, 35%, said yes. Asked if they think that people with a serious mental illness should be forced by law to take medicine to control their behavior, 69% of those surveyed said yes. 19% said no, and 12% were either unsure or did not respond. When asked their opinion on whether people with a serious mental illness should be forced by law to be committed to a hospital for treatment, 59% said yes, 25% said no, and 16% were unsure or refused to answer. And when asked how comfortable they would be living next door to someone who has a serious mental illness, a total of 47% of respondents said they would be very or somewhat uncomfortable. Now, a total of 45% of residents said they would be somewhat or very comfortable with the situation. 8% were unsure. So let's start there. What do you think about that particular situation? Say you live next door to someone who had a serious mental illness. By show of hands, who would have an issue with that? Who would feel uncomfortable with that? We have one hand up. We have a wide, open-minded base here. And let me ask you, Richard, if someone was next door that did have a mental illness, why would that make you feel uncomfortable?
Well, because it made me uncomfortable because what if that person has had violent tendencies in the past, and which you would not be knowing of that. So suppose that he is suffering from a psychotic break, and so you will not, if you were, say, visiting him, and he comes over, you might not know if he will become violent towards you.
The mystery of it all. You don't know all the answers. It's a blank canvas. Would anyone else feel kind of similar in that case? Or if not, let me find someone who'd like to say, I don't think it's not a big issue. Let me start with Bethany.
I think it would depend a lot on whether or not they're being treated. I guess finding that information out, if they're refusing treatment, off medication, then I probably would be a little more uncomfortable. But if they were a well-functioning individual on medication, doing their everyday tasks, then I wouldn't have a problem with that at all.
And Mark, you also had your thoughts?
Yes, I would feel comfortable with it, and people with mental illness are less likely to commit a violent crime than someone without mental illness.
Okay.
People without mental illnesses commit violent crimes, and so the likelihood is slim.
Since we don't know everything about everyone, and you just don't know who you may be passing by, but as far as your neighbors, your friends, does anybody, once again, by a show of hands, does anybody know of a friend or a family member that has a mental illness? Goodness, that's significant. And getting the facts and information behind that particular individual's situation is key, is it not, Mark?
Yes, it is correct. I have several family members in my family with mental illness, and I'm very comfortable as well interacting with such individuals with my family members. They're not violent. Every once in a while you might have a psychotic episode or something may be raise concern for us, or whatever the case may be, but we seek and intervene and get help. But
how hard or easy is it to receive help for your family members?
Well, I think the stigma around, first of all, for family members to really want to get treatment, that makes plays a major role. But for those who want to seek and get help, to the ones that I've assisted, it has not been that difficult. It has not been that difficult to receive services or treatment.
Has anybody else experienced that, or a different experience? Go ahead, David.
I had a neighbor who had some pretty serious mental health issues, and I guess it just the thing that's sort of frightening sometimes, especially I guess with bipolar people who also may be psychotic or schizophrenic, is whether they take their medication or not. That's the biggest problem as I see it. I guess a lot of times it's maybe a family member that can monitor that, but but I guess that's the real threat when they don't take their medication.
And it sounds to me as if that's a key, having a support system, having family or friends that have an idea of just what this particular individual may need on a daily basis with medicines or contact. John, you're a paramedic. You see this more than
virtually every single day.
Really?
as a medical professional, I wouldn't see that it will be a big problem, or I wouldn't consider it as me being uncomfortable. They are individuals. They are people too. Now, ultimately, it is up to them to decide whether or not they want to receive treatment. But in my line of work, we also play the role of counselor. And so by being some type of support system, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a medical professional, it could be a next door neighbor, it could be a family member, it could be a friend, just to be able to show genuine concern and encourage them and check in on them from time to time, it probably may spark them to be able to want to receive treatment, to want to be able to be better.
We have basically a question that's part of this discussion. Where does law enforcement, where does the government come into play? Should people who are mentally ill be forced to stay on their meds? And if they don't, should police step in? Robin, what do you think?
Forced? I mean, I have a chronic illness of multiple sclerosis. You can't force me to take medicine. How can you? It is an illness, and that's what we seem to forget.
Your MS, though, isn't a danger necessarily to me. That would be possible.
If I was driving.
Well, yes. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, so you believe it's a personal issue and not necessarily something that needs intervention?
I think it needs intervention. I just don't know how you can possibly do that and be fair to the person as well. It is a personal choice, and unfortunately, it does affect some other lives, but everybody's illness affects other lives. Any kind of illness does.
Michael, those lives affect you. You're a law enforcement officer. Tell me of your firsthand experience on the job when dealing with mental illness, and what are the toughest things you have to deal with?
It is, because we have to determine, and sometimes very short order, whether it is a mental illness, whether it's somebody who's just angry. So you've got to try and decide very quickly. And of course, we're called in if somebody's acting bizarre in some cases. So you just run out, and then you're faced with trying to figure it out. Sometimes it is from a family member, because the person's undergoing a psychotic episode or something of that nature. So we have a little bit of the background. And then if we can make the determination initially that the person's a danger to themselves or to someone else, then we take them into protective custody. And then we let the medical professional decide what to do from there.
Daphne, the organization NAMI, what is that?
National Alliance on Mental Illness. It's the largest grassroots organization. We have family members and consumers that are part of the organization, and we do education, advocacy, taking care of yourself as the caregiver. These are important things, and we also, all of our members represent together, and then NAMI goes to Congress and lobbies for mental health issues.
And what's the biggest takeaway you can leave with us that maybe folks who are not on the front lines dealing with it every day, what's that big takeaway you would recommend or suggest?
Everything NAMI does is free. We have vast information online, as well as we have support group meetings for consumers and family members. And the consumers lead the consumer group. And a consumer is a person who has a mental illness. That's just a term that is used instead of person with mental illness as a consumer. And the family groups are led by family members of those who live with mental illness. So we're not therapy, we are support. We're not professionals, we are support. And the different affiliates in the state have support groups at different times. And that's the biggest thing that people should know, is that we're there for support, and everything we do is free.
This is just round one of the conversation. It's a 60-minute show, but right now that is all the time we have for this portion. When we return, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to further discuss defining dangerous in Louisiana. Welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight we're discussing mental health issues in Louisiana. Joining us now is our panel of experts. Dr. William Beau Clark is the coroner for East Baton Rouge Parish. He is board certified by the American Board of Emergency Medicine. Among the services provided by his office are orders of protective custody and coroner emergency certificates for the mentally ill. Dr. Rochelle Head Dunham is the interim secretary of Louisiana's Department of Health and Hospitals, Office of Behavioral Health. Dr. Dunham also serves as State Mental Health Commissioner of the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors. She has double board certifications in adult and addiction psychiatry. Michael Waguespack was first elected as Sheriff of Assumption Parish in 1999 and was reelected in 2003 and 2007. He has served as a member of the National Sheriff's Association and is the current president of the Louisiana Sheriff's Association. And Dr. Michael Blue is a forensic psychiatrist on the faculty of Tulane's Medical School. He completed his residency in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Most recently, Dr. Blue served as the clinical director of the Secure Forensic Facility at the Eastern Louisiana Mental Health System in Jackson. And want to thank you all very much for being here on LPB.
Thanks for having us.
Before we go to our audience for questions, if you could each very briefly tell us from your perspective what your role is when interacting with someone with mental illness. And let me begin with you.
Sure. I have a dual role when interacting with people with mental illness. You have one that's a clinical role where I'm come in contact with patients who suffer from different forms of mental illness and are seeking treatment and require treatment and assistance. The other is in a forensic role where people have come in contact with either the civil or the criminal justice system, and I'm being asked a specific question by the court, whether it's to evaluate someone for competence to stand trial, whether or not someone should be held legally culpable for committing a crime, or whether or not someone should be compensated for some perceived injury in an accident.
Okay, Sheriff Waguespack.
Yeah, I guess we play a dual role as well. You know, we're the first line of defense. Often the first call is made to law enforcement to respond to a mental illness situation. You know, and at that point, we get involved in working with the coroner to make sure we get the person properly placed, get the proper psychiatric care. But oftentimes it ends up being an arrest. And as you'll ask, you can poll the remaining sheriffs. I'm one of 64. All of us are slowly becoming a warehouse for the mentally ill. Our jails and prisons are certainly full of them. It's getting worse as I see it. So, again, we're the first line of defense. We make the initial contact. If we can't get them to help, generally family members or others, it becomes a point where we have to make an arrest. And fortunately, we're incarcerating way too many that do not quite have the services there in a prison setting.
Dr. Head Dunham.
As the Assistant Secretary for the Department of Health and Hospitals Office of Behavioral Health, my role is primarily in policy setting, determination of what are appropriate services to be funded for the state of Louisiana, both for the public sector as well as for those who receive reimbursement through Medicaid for services, but also as medical director for the office to apply my knowledge of addiction psychiatry in directing the medical needs that are most appropriate, evidence-based practices that are necessary for our service delivery systems to implement to make sure that people who suffer from behavioral health illnesses, which are both mental illness and addictive disorders, are received.
And Dr. Clark?
As the coroner of East Baton Rouge Parish, I have a dual role. My first one that was described earlier in the program has to do with what's called the Order of Protective Custody. And that's how a concerned citizen in our community who recognizes behavior that might be a person might be a danger to themselves or a danger to others can come swear an affidavit in front of me, and we can get that person into a hospital for an evaluation. That's the first step. The second step comes with if we're going to keep them or have involuntary confinement. And the coroner would present and give an opinion, and the coroner being either the coroner or deputy coroner being a physician, give a medical opinion of whether that person is a danger, essentially by interviewing the patient. And that person, and that process is called a coroner's emergency certificate, or a CEC.
All right, we have a wonderful group of panelists. We have a wonderful group here of citizens, and who would like to go first with a question for our panel? I see Richard's hand up. You're the big volunteer. Go ahead, Richard.
No, I am curious because what if there's a seriously mental ill patient that is in need of medical attention but is homeless and you can't find them? How would you be able to give them the services that they need?
Yeah, Richard, that's a very good question. Homeless and mentally ill. It's a situation I'm sure you all are very aware with. Who would like to tackle that first?
I don't mind
Okay.
tackling that one. That is a significant and not a unique problem that is frequently faced. Oftentimes, it has to come to our awareness that this homeless person requires assistance prior so that we can start to look for them. So if there is someone that comes in contact with a homeless person, they may file a report, they may contact the police department, and usually that's the first line of contact with someone who is homeless, whether you think that's fortunate or unfortunate. Oftentimes, it can be very difficult to locate people in the community that are homeless. They move around. But I have noticed during some of our efforts that there are certain spots in certain cities where you usually can find a large number of homeless and mentally ill individuals, and those stops tend to be the first. In New Orleans, it tends to be under certain bridges. There's a large homeless community that suffers from mental illness there, and those are usually the first stops that we go to.
Sheriff Waguespack, you mentioned you are on the first lines of defense. Let's say you find someone, identify that individual as mentally ill. What happens next? What do you do as a law enforcement
Well,
officer?
in general, we're called when there's obviously a psychotic episode going on. It could be they're attempting to harm others or harm themselves. I mean, I've been on the scene of a guy having a noose around his neck and a sword to his throat, and so obviously having a very psychotic breakdown. It's very delicate. It's very dangerous. It's dangerous for the officers. It's dangerous for the individual involved. We just manage the crisis as best we can. We bring in the best team we can to talk him down and eventually get him the help. Obviously, the first call we're going to make is to the coroner and said, look, this is the situation. We're bringing him into the ER. Please make the call to the sitting physician so that we can begin the process of evaluating and finding bed space. That has been our challenge lately, is finding the bed space, especially for the uninsured and those are indigent. It's not available. The state, in its budget woes, has cut funding for the beds. We've gone to some improvisation, and I've seen cases where we've had folks held up in the ER for 3 days, and eventually they're turned back in not so good situations.
Dr. Dunham, what can you do? What do you do when you're facing these challenging issues?
So also tying in the issue of homelessness. So one of the things that we feel is very important at the state level is that we're really, really careful and really, really keen on what are the appropriate array of services that people need to remain well or recovered. Hospital-based care serves a purpose, but there are numerous levels of care that keep people well in the community. And so a lot of our efforts have centered on how do you keep people well in their community to reduce the need for them to go into the most expensive level of care, which is hospital-based care. Have hospital-based care available, but don't solely rely on that, because that's not where you're going to get your best outcomes. We know that historically. Hospitalizing people is not going to get the best outcomes for them. We have funding for permanent supportive housing that's available for the severely mentally ill in particular, because we recognize that if you are unemployed and if you don't have a place to stay, you probably will not be well, independent of what your mental status is. And so we do have an effort, an initiative in place with the Louisiana Housing Authority, wherein Magellan, our statewide management organization, does the application process, they do the reviewing, and they align people with housing who meet the severe and mentally ill criteria for services, which is the population, the carve-out population within mental health populations that individuals have the most concern for, because they are the most vulnerable. So our efforts center more around using our funding to align with what we know to be best practices for community-based services to diminish the need for people to need hospital-based stays.
Dr. Clark, Earl K. Long Medical Center had closed its beds. It closed the whole facility, including the beds to help treat folks with mental illness. How severe a blow is that in your opinion?
Well, it's tremendous, and we've got to put it in some general terms for you. In the inpatient environment, we have both long-term facilities and short-term facilities. The majority of people might need a short-term stay to get stabilized to then move into an outpatient setting. And like the doctor said, outpatient is where we want people to be. That means they're taking their medications and they're surviving in our community and being productive members of society, as we all would want them to. The problem is when you reduce the number of long-term beds, make that pool smaller, then it backs the system up. Those long-term patients are now in short-term beds, okay? And then that reduces the number of short-term beds, which backs things up into the emergency room, okay? And when the emergency room gets overcrowded, it backs things up into the street. And when things in the street get overcrowded, then there's not a place to send the mental health patient, and then you end up in the sheriff's jail. And that's ultimately our biggest issue. But it comes down to access. It's all about access. And we want to make sure that we connect the patient with the right type of care that they need at that moment. And it exists out there in our community. We just have challenges of trying to get the patients where they need to go.
Peter, I'm going to go to you. What is your question you'd like to ask the panel?
I'd like to ask Dr. Dunham if her job wouldn't be somewhat simpler had the state of Louisiana expanded Medicaid.
I'm glad you asked that question, believe it or not, because the simplest answer is no, not really. And the reason why I say that is because, so what we've done is we've taken what we have. Basically, that's where we are. We've taken what we've had, we've reshuffled the deck, and we are now looking more strategically, more clinically at what the full spectrum of need really is. The full spectrum of need, as we've determined, has not been met by our service delivery system, despite the money we had, because we were not really targeting the right areas of need. And so what has happened is, interestingly enough, in reshuffling and relooking at how we should apportion our dollars, existing dollars, we are actually have a larger network of providers. We brought in managed care in March 1st of 2012. With that, we've been able to expand our provider network, believe it or not, from 800 providers to 1,700 providers. We've increased the number of evidence-based services that we're providing more than ever before. We had as a target our first year to see 50,000 kids. We've seen over 85,000 children. This was same money, 85,000 kids. We've had as a target for adult populations to see 100,000 adults. We've seen over 100,000 adults. My point being, the money that we've had or our availability to provide services really was contingent on how we structure our healthcare system. And so that restructuring has really allowed us to not only expand the network of providers, we've increased the number of services, we've also increased hospital-based availability of care by partnering with different partners. And so we've got over 800 hospitals that serve indigent, nearly 2,000 that are contracted with Magellan to deliver some mental health services.
What does the indigent patient that doesn't have health care insurance do to get the care that they need, even if they're willing to stay at home and be outside of an institution?
So I think the difficulty with our perception of our system of care for behavioral health is an absence of knowledge of what is available. So what does an indigent person do, or what's available to an indigent person? We have state-funded throughout the state of Louisiana regional, local areas that are managed by an executive director and a board as safety net service providers for the indigent, strictly for the indigent. That has been really the core of our behavioral health system for decades. Not very well publicized, not very well known, but I think Mark Thomas mentioned earlier that he's not had difficulty getting his relatives into care because he's knowledgeable about those systems that are available across the state, which provide public indigent care every day, 24 hours. So I think one of our difficulties, and I acknowledge that within our system, is we have not done the best job of educating our public about what is available within behavioral health services.
I'm going to go with John. You have a question?
Yes, sir. Research has led to the identity and to be able to diagnose mental illnesses. And there are services that are available initially through the funding that provides for the research. So my question is there any funding that will provide for community or outpatient care versus other than going back to the hospital? And if there's not, then why isn't there money that's geared towards outpatient or upkeep in outpatient care to prevent people with mental illnesses from having to go back through the hospital and going back through the system again?
Dr. Blue, could I maybe have you start on that?
Sure. Probably Dr. Dunham is a better expert to answer that question, but I can say that I've observed that during the process of deinstitutionalization, there was a move where more patients were discharged at a faster rate than us setting up the infrastructure in the community to be able to provide those outpatient services that you described. So there was a shift of patients out of the system, but those community wraparound support systems weren't completely set up yet. Dr. Dunham kind of seems to have indicated that there's more services available than a lot of us may be aware of, and that they want to do a better job of educating people about those services, and I hope that that definitely can continue to take place. And I definitely hope that that is true. In my experience from what I've seen is that once people are out of the system, the hospital operates in a much different role than I think it should systematically. When you look at with a systems analysis of it, the hospital should serve as a safety net. It really should serve as when people who are getting those services in the community decompensate. The hospital is available to stabilize people, okay? But what we've seen is more of a revolving door where people go out into a community where services, they lack access to services and or services are lacking. They decompensate and wind up right back into the hospital, which has led to shorter hospital stays. People tend to be discharged a lot sooner than you would prefer because of the lack of number of beds available to be able to treat those people.
And I would add to that, understand tonight we're talking about mental illness, but we're still talking about illness, right? Okay? And illness, it's the same issue whether you have high blood pressure, diabetes, or any other kind of medical problem. A lot of times our community thinks the access point, well, I'll just go to the emergency room, right? Well, is it really an emergency? And certainly some are, okay? But some certainly are not. And the same goes with mental illness. So it's all about access to care. Can you have a cold and go see your primary doctor? Probably a lot better than going to the emergency room for your cold, wouldn't you agree? Because you're holding a bed that potentially somebody who's having a heart attack or a stroke might need. And so mental illness, it fits into the same illness categories that we're talking about. Tim, go ahead.
The one thing that I haven't heard addressed up to this point is basically the impetus for the conversation is how do we deal with those individuals who have mental health issues who pose potentially a danger to the public. And the concern, the question that I've always had, particularly when you deal with these issues is how do you begin to accommodate the personal rights of these individuals under the Constitution and couple those issues that you have with that with those individuals who may or may not be on the system's radar. So my concern is, before we engage all of these mechanisms that the state in its administrative and policy arm has in place to treat these individuals, what do we do to cross that threshold? Because there has to be something to trigger the system to know this person needs our help or this person needs attention or before, when the sheriff gets involved.
Exactly. Sheriff, you go on a call. How do you decide whether this person is going to jail or a hospital?
Well, we have a small enough population. We kind of know our problem folks. There are people that we refer to as 103M. They're mental. It's a very tricky area of debate we're venturing into now. My worst nightmare is an active shooter in a school situation or a courthouse, etc. The reality is most of these active shooters have had a history of mental illness. Under the HIPAA laws, we're not aware of a lot of that stuff. Most of the information we get is from family members or friends or close associates. So, there's a debate, should there be a process or a registry if there's somebody deemed to have mental illness? Does that information get reported to a bank so that when a background check is done, and when they're shopping at Cabela's to buy multiple guns, nothing's caught. At this point in time, there is no registry. There is no debate. So how do we tread on their constitutional rights to a certain extent? If it's really not, quote unquote, been deemed a mental patient. Okay, so when they do the work and they go into to the history of these folks, we're uncovering a lot of, I guess, gaps in what we should have done. But the bottom line is stabilization is the key. We've got to have the short-term beds to get them stabilized. We also need access, good access. To answer your question about the indigent, Labdeville, Louisiana, Assumption Parish held our only state-funded mental evaluation spot. Now these folks who are seeing mental health are now having to go to Morgan City, about a 45-minute ride. Many of these indigent people do not have transportation. So if we're going to deinstitutionalize, we've got to have the infrastructure in place in our communities to serve the needs, because there's a big gap. Don't fool yourself. In the real world, in the front lines, we don't have the short-term beds, and the access is not there. Certainly, if you want to provide more information, we're all ears. Appreciate your help.
Dr. Book?
A couple of things. You asked a really important question when you talked about the trigger. What triggers the discussion or the movement towards forcing someone to engage in treatment, forcing someone to be hospitalized? When you look at court decisions that have happened nationwide, you got a couple of important constitutional principles that are balanced against the liberty interest, okay? The government has a specific responsibility, two of them. One of them is police powers. Another one is Latin, it's called parens patriae, right? And so it basically says that we have the responsibility as government to care for the safety of the citizens, even if it may be against the wishes of the particular citizen. That has to be balanced against an individual's right to privacy and a right to self-determination. So what you're really asking is, at what point, what is the tipping point? When do we tip over into the point where this person can be cajoled or forced into psychiatric treatment, psychiatric evaluation, or involuntary committal, okay? Well, that right seems to happen, that tipping point seems to happen when the person becomes dangerous to self or dangerous to others. If there's objective evidence that a person is dangerous to themselves and dangerous to others, at that point you can fill out something called a physician's emergency certificate or a coroner's emergency certificate. That brings them into the system. That brings them in for a minimum of 15 days, at which point they undergo evaluation. Then you have mental health professionals that can determine whether that should be extended and what type of treatment should happen. Prior to that, it is presumed legally that everyone in the United States of America has the right to refuse treatment. Okay, if you don't want to get treatment for whatever medical malady you may have, no one can force you to get that treatment. Okay, even a mental illness. The complication with mental illness comes in is you're trying to communicate with the organ that has the dysfunction.
Right.
Certain types of mental illness impair your ability to reason. You may have a formal thought disorder, and so even then, certain types of mental illness, a person has delusions of a benign nature, auditory hallucinations telling them that they're wonderful and that God loves them. They're allowed to be mentally ill and exist in society without being forced into treatment. But when they become dangerous to self or dangerous to others, that appears to be the tipping point legally, to answer your question directly.
Let me go ahead. Louisiana has some excellent laws when it pertains to getting the person what they need. Now, the ability to have what they need is another problem. But what I want to describe to you is what's called the order of protective custody. And that's when any citizen in this room, any citizen in our community can come to my office and say, hey, I think my neighbor, they've got a problem and we need to get them checked out, okay? And then we can pick them up and get them checked out, all right?
Now when you do say that, is that a phone call away? How does that work?
You actually come to the office and swear an affidavit, because it is an affidavit. It is your word that you think they are a danger to themselves or a danger to others. And then we pick them up and we have them evaluated by a professional, usually a physician. And it's helping with that balance of their civil liberties and actually their involuntary committal in that circumstance. I'll give you an example. Just north to us, Arkansas, the same OPC process, by the way, which can be done here in Louisiana. We can go do one right now if there's an issue, okay? In Arkansas, you have to go in front of a judge, and it costs you $80 to get done, okay? So first of all, you got to have $80, and then you have to get a spot in front of a judge. So how long do you think people may wait to get a very needed OPC, okay? And so you see the scenario there. So although we have a system that needs assistance and direction and help, I want to say that we do have a mechanism in place in our state, and we should be proud of that. I think it is a good mechanism. It's the other side that we need to address and work on.
Dr. Dunn, may I ask you quickly, what are some of the warning signs parents can be aware of if their child is exhibiting dangerous tendencies that could hurt themselves or others?
Well, there are a number of signs that are pretty overt, and then there are subtle signs. And both of those are contingent on, if it's your child, how well you know your child. And in most instances, parents do recognize that their children are having difficulty. They may be having odd or unusual behavior. That's one sign. They can be change in the friends or the people that they're spending time with. We can't ignore the contribution of substance use in this scenario, because more likely than not, impulsive behavior is very likely related to substance use or the need to prevent the discomfort of withdrawal from substances, recognizing that that may be a contributor, and really acknowledging the change. There's a lot of difficulty in acknowledging that your loved one is exhibiting behavior that's not normal. Mm-hmm. So owning that, and then really seeking pretty aggressively what services are available is very important. But the other thing I wanted to say too is that, you know, we talk about dangerousness, we talk about mental illness, we talk about what does the system need to do. We talk about it from the perspective of the behavioral health professionals being the primary persons who are responsible for managing this difficulty. And the reality is our healthcare system is constructed in such a way that is malaligned with how human beings are constructed. And I say that from the perspective that people present holistically in the experience of their difficulties. If you present to a primary care doctor, you're still attached in terms of your behavioral health capacity to function. So why would not our primary care system be engaged as well in making some determinations about whether or not a person is functioning well? I'll tell you, 17% of individuals who have committed suicide on the same day that they saw their primary care doctor. Now keep in mind that the majority of our population is going to see a primary care specialist, not a behavioral health specialist. And so what do we do with that? One of the things we need to do is to make sure that there is minimal triaging or minimal screening of every healthcare professional. One or two questions can give you the tip off to the fact that there may be something going on behaviorally. So I think this discussion also needs to think from the perspective of engaging change in our entire healthcare system, not just in our behavioral health system of care.
Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to also follow up on another question that was in the room. It was kind of a little bit understated, and that is what happens when you have someone who has a history of mental illness and they're in Cabela's trying to purchase a handgun, you know, or in your local gun store. We also have to realize the balance there, too. I think currently there is a provision under Louisiana state law that allows that if a person has been deemed or adjudicated mentally incompetent to stand trial, or been adjudicated not guilty by reason of insanity, right, or has been involuntarily committed to a hospital, that person does go into the NCIC system and that they're not allowed to have access to a handgun. But
that's true, but the ones that haven't reached that level.
Correct. But, and that's where I'm headed. But if you're just a person that suffers from any mental illness or a serious mental illness, there is no mechanism by which to report that. And the question is, should there be? Because if a person, just because a person suffers from a mental disease or a mental defect, doesn't necessarily mean that they should or should not have a right to own a firearm. And the other thing is that private health, that protected private health information, how do you create public access to that at that point? So those are important considerations to think about.
My concern in listening to the doctor was about whether when you have individuals who have mental health issues, once they get to the system, if we start to approach the question of how this information becomes available to the necessary persons in law enforcement and otherwise, what is there to stop the floodgates from overwhelming the system once you start to put these kinds of mechanisms in place that allow for such liberal access to people's private health information? And what's to stop others who may mean well but be misguided, and to stop these individuals from being stigmatized or malaffected by the mechanisms that we put in place?
Exactly. Yeah. Our discussion is presumptive to some degree in that it assumes that if you have a mental illness, you're more likely to be dangerous or commit a criminal act. Right. And none of our data supports that. Right. And yet, if you violate the codes of HIPAA, you've really made even more information available that can prejudicially judge people who are not the ones that we really should be concerned about. So there are reasons for HIPAA and 42 CFR, which is even more restrictive.
And one step further than that, a lot of our discussion also presupposes that it is the mental illness itself that is the cause of the aggregate violence, when you have to understand that moral depravity and mental illness are not mutually exclusive. And so you can have someone who is mentally ill and morally depraved, and the reason that they take their actions may not necessarily be connected to mental illness. You can have people, obviously, who are morally depraved and not mentally ill. And so it's my job oftentimes to see the difference between the two. Oftentimes I've brought in as an expert to evaluate, was this action undertaken secondary to moral depravity, or was this action undertaken because the person is psychotic and delusional and could not distinguish between right and wrong with respect to their actions?
Dwayne, you've been very patient. I know you have a question for our panel.
This goes along with Tim's question. The government often has mandates for kids to go to school, for car owners to have car insurance. Should the mentally ill be mandated to receive care, because it would be for the betterment of society, for children going to school and for car owners to have car insurance?
Well,
who wants to take it?
The right, well, first, it presupposes that driving is a right, when actually it's a privilege. So that's kind of one reason why there's a separation. Driving actually is not a right in the United States of America, and so those restrictions can be placed upon access to be able to do it. The requirement for children to go to school, again, there are many functions and ways a child can be educated. Not everyone necessarily has to show up at Catholic High or at a public school to be educated in the United States of America, but there are certain requirements that are placed. It's a reasonable question, but the main reason why you can't require someone to receive mental health treatment is because of that person's well-documented constitutional right to refuse treatment. And it's been adjudicated through the courts and well-established. There are circumstances at which that right can be somewhat infringed upon, and it really tips on whether the person is dangerous to self, dangerous to others, and or gravely disabled.
Sitting right next to John, lovely lady whose name tag is blocked, so forgive me. Your question.
My name is Akai. My question is, what can we do to identify those people who have a history of mental health problems, mental health illness, or even incidents that's happened in the past where it was reported to sheriff's office or a hospital where they sought treatment, especially for those students that are doing things like enrolling in higher education institutions or seeking jobs that would help children, where they could potentially be a danger not only to themselves but to those people that they serve as well.
Dr. Dunn?
So I would say the first thing is to become informed about what's available, because I would suggest to you that a large percentage of our population is really not aware of what's available in our system for treatment of behavioral health, mental illness in the state of Louisiana. So becoming informed. The other thing is, once again, I think that it is a responsibility for all of us on some level to address this problem from our own various vantage points. You've got a mix of professionals up here because we all touch it from a different perspective, but we don't have all points of intersection with mental illness represented here. And so I think it behooves us to be sensitive to the fact that this is not, or these are not conditions that are necessarily going to be seen by mental health professionals, but they're probably more likely to be seen by people who are non-mental health professionals, family members, other professional types. And so educating and placing some responsibility. The school system has a responsibility. The healthcare system at large has a responsibility. I think that there's a broader conversation here, once again, that needs to take place from a preventative perspective, because what you're talking about is prevention. Yes. And we've been spending a lot of time talking about treatment.
Sheriff Waguespack, I'm going to leave the final thought with you. What do you want to make sure folks walking away on this conversation need to know?
Well, it's a balance, and we just need to be more responsive and work smarter because the resources are limited. We know that. So, but we've got, as the deputies and first responders respond, we're the first contact. We've got to have access to stabilize them. And from there, we need to have the infrastructure in place so that the treatment can continue and follow through. There's a lot of advanced medicine prescriptions that are there for treatment, but a lot of times we just don't have the infrastructure in place to follow through or give them the direct access, especially the uninsured, the poor. They're not getting it. And, things have come to the point where if They find out, we make the call to get a bed, no insurance, engine, okay, we'll get back with you. 3 days later, they're still sitting in the ER. That's a problem because they're going back to the street and they're going to end up in my institution or the jail or DO's Department of Corrections. So we've got to work smarter. We've got to get these folks access.
I want to thank you all for being part of this dynamic conversation, and I want to thank the panelists as well for just excellent questions. We could carry on this conversation for hours, and you know what? We in LPB, that's our pride to do so. You'll be able to see this program online anytime you want, and we are going to continue this conversation down the road. We'd like to thank our panelists, Dr. Clark, Dr. Head Dunham, Sheriff Waguespack, and Dr. Blue for their insights on this month's topic. When we come back, we'll have a few closing comments.
Well, Charlie, a very interesting topic, one in which we learned a lot of new information.
Absolutely, and it's forums like this that there's more than just one person you have to ask these questions to. You need law enforcement, you need doctors, and family and friends that know people who have a mental illness. This was a great start of a great conversation on a very important topic.
Well, and I hope we can then list some more information perhaps on the website about where people might go to find additional resources. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Louisiana Public Square. We encourage you to visit our website at lpb.org/public square. While you're there, take this month's survey, view interview clips, and comment on tonight's show. We'd love to hear from you like we did from viewers following this month's special presentation, Breaking Away. We were following the Frontline program about the proposed incorporation of the city of St. George and the implications for education in East Baton Rouge Parish. John writes to us, I want my address to remain Baton Rouge, not St. George. St. George will need to build a governing identity as well as more schools. This means more taxes. Miriam writes, though my children are grown and gone, it would please me greatly if the St. George effort resulted in better public schools for every child in the parish. And Twitter follower Jerry Edwards tweeted to us, excellent debate with people who are on the front line of the St. George movement, and they are all very respectful. Well, thanks to everyone for their comments.
President Barack Obama says the Federal Highway Trust Fund is expected to run out of money by the end of August unless Congress acts soon. And Louisiana's current state budget siphons $60 million from its Transportation Trust Fund to cover costs of the Louisiana State Police. Is it time for a new funding system and a new funding stream? Louisiana Public Square looks for answers next month on Down the Road, Our Transportation Future. Thanks for watching, everyone, and good night.
Good night.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.
Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.